On behalf of B3, the Jewish Boomer Platform, welcome to Active Aging Engagement in a Post-Pandemic World, a Jewish communal reboot. This is our first national convening focused on the emerging field of active aging in Jewish life. I am Jessica Balboni, Associate Vice President of the Mandel Center for Leadership at the Jewish Federations of North America, and it is my great pleasure to be with each of you today. The goal of this convening is to co-create with you a shared Jewish active aging agenda, one that can help transform our Jewish communities in ways that will invigorate multi-generational communication and strengthen Jewish life. Today's program features experts and activists who deeply understand aging, active aging, intergenerational connections, Jewish life, social causes, activism, and more. You have all received the speakers' bios, so you know what a terrific group we've assembled, and you will have the link to their bios in the chat so that you can reference them throughout this program. We will begin today by grounding the conversation in data and research. We will then explore active aging program models to inspire your practice and learning. We will present a keynote address by Mark Friedman, founder and co-CEO of Encore.org, and of course, hear from you, the field, with breakout sessions throughout the day. During this program, you will have the opportunity to submit questions for our speakers, and we encourage you to do so. Please use the chat function to submit these. And if you have any technical difficulties or questions during the program, please direct them to Sophie Hearn at JFNA in the chat. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Stuart Himmelfarb, the co-founder of B3.
Thank you, Jessica, and good morning, everyone. And I want to begin by first thanking our two terrific partners, the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan's Wexler Center for Modern Aging and the Jewish Federations of North America. You'll hear more about them later on. I also want to thank the Natan Fund and the Sephardic Foundation on Aging for their support and funding. As Jessica said, we have a full agenda today, and we purposely tried to cover a wide variety of topics, from understanding the impact of the pandemic on Jewish life and engagement to our keynote speakers' groundbreaking work on co-generational initiatives, and to case studies on programs that already are working in this field. We want to share insights about active aging and ignite interest in imagining new ways to engage people in Jewish and civic life as they move through this life stage. This is the time from midlife careers and into retirement that we're focusing on. We'll end with a discussion on the new active aging network that David Elcott and I at B3 are forming, and also our new web resource and how we can together chart our course from here. We have frequent opportunities for conversations in the breakout rooms and Q&As with our speakers, so we look forward to hearing from you all. And we'll also be in touch after the convening to continue the conversation. At this point, I'd like to turn it back to Jessica to introduce my partner. Back to Jess.
Thanks, Stuart. So in this next segment, we're going to hear from three expert academics. First, Dr. David Elcott will help us explore what the data tells us about active aging. After, we will hear from Dr. Janet Aronson and Dr. Kathy Pike about engagement and affiliation issues of older adults in a post-pandemic setting. We will have a Q&A with Dr. Aronson and Dr. Pike, followed by our first breakout session before we break for lunch. Again, we encourage you, please do submit those questions in the chat in real time as you hear from our speakers throughout the program. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Elcott, the Taub Professor of Practice at NYU's Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Service and co-founder of B3.
Good morning. One of the goals of our being together is to share information, to feel that we kind of have a level playing field here, that we all have at least some core information, knowing, of course, that many of you have lots and lots of information, data, experience in the area of aging. And hopefully during the course of the day, you'll be able to add that as well. But at this moment, we just have a little bit that, or I have a little bit that I'd like to be able to present, and we've got slides to be able to begin that. Hopefully, okay. Are you not going to present my slides? In which case I can do it myself.
David, your slides are up and ready for you.
It's great. I don't see them. Does everybody else see them? That's great. Why don't I? That's strange. I'm the only one who's not seeing them. Okay, good. First slide, which you'll have to tell me what we're looking at. The first slide, there we go. The first slide is perhaps the most important for us. It shows us what once was the view of the way that societies functioned. You had a large base of young people that tapered to a smaller number at the top. That was back in the 1500s, 1600s, well into the 1900s and 20th century as well. But now you look at the prediction and you see something very different. Frankly, no society in history has looked like this. So we are in completely uncharted territory. What it does tell us is, though, that a significant portion of life is going to be spent in the period between 50 and above. And even if you look at that 85 and older, of which we don't have to presume that we're looking only at difficult geriatric cases, but we're looking actually at people who are still functioning vitally within society, it tells us two things. One, this is an important asset from which we want to take advantage. That's one. And two, that we have an obligation within the Jewish community, along with societies in general, to find ways to be able to engage, re-engage, engage for the first time those people in this cohort. So when you look at just these numbers, it's telling you that, and it's telling you one more thing very pragmatically for us. If we are not able to engage or re-engage this cohort, it is very unlikely that we could sustain the Jewish community, because that cohort has resources and capacities that are absolutely essential for our community. So when you look at us, it's even more pronounced than the society at large. That's because we are older as a community. Basically, when you see this, you're seeing that about half of those in the Jewish community are 55 and older, essentially people who most probably do not have children at home, except during the pandemic when kids came back, but they don't have children living at home, and they don't naturally engage with the Jewish community. Their children have been bar bat mitzvah, if that's the case, perhaps even weddings have taken place, that the next major life event for people 55 and older as Jews would be a funeral. And therefore, we've got this huge chunk of time in which we're going to be able to do something significant. I do want to show you something else. It's a really interesting study. It's a study across the world. And they looked at different age cohorts and asked about characteristics. Boomers, more than any other group, had these positive characteristics, which may or may not sound like them: respectful, work-centric, community-oriented, right? And the types of things that often people had said about aging, selfish, right? In fact, is not the case. So that this is telling us, if you're thinking about this cohort, to think about them not as people who are grabbing and grasping for themselves, but seeing them as an extraordinary potential for Jewish viability, for communal success, for communal engagement. In fact, even when we think about issues like young leadership, to reverse our thinking and saying, well, you've got people who've worked in their lives, raised their children, They now have the time, the energy, and the resources to be able to actually do something. And look at this, they're viewed positively. So engaging them actually becomes a crucial element of communal success. Again, adding just to our data, this is most recent information, right? It's about boomers in general. My guess is that within the Jewish community, based on our research, over the last decade, we could say this is probably even more. They're more likely to engage in those activities that make use of their talent, skills, and life experience. This is actually very important for us. What makes this generation different, most probably from the war generation, the Great Generation, is that they're not interested in being asked to engage in a community in the way the community says it wants them to be. But rather, the feeling is, I've got skills, I've got experience, I've got talents. I want to bring that into my volunteerism, or in some cases, my quasi-professionalism. In other words, I want to be known for who I am, for what I have achieved, accomplished, for what I know. And I think that that has to be a different orientation when we think about volunteering and when we think about engagement. The idea that, for example, somebody will serve as a treasurer of an organization, and when there's a report to be given, they'll turn to the professional and say, okay, you have to give this because I don't understand it. Chances are very good you're talking to people on in this age group, on your boards, on your volunteer committees, you're talking to people who are well-educated, with college degrees, if not advanced degrees, and excellent experience. If you can't take advantage of that, if you don't have a way to utilize that, recognize that, and honor that, it's unlikely that they will be working with your organization. This statistic that came out recently, that's looking until 2017, hit me broadside. I did not expect this at all. Right? That the increase in workers in the United States, and of course, this is pre-pandemic, it's 2017, published in 2018, so it was just on the cusp of the pandemic, but that older workers are in fact working. They are not retiring, and I think that's very significant. The data showing by Boston University was a U-curve, that people on the very poor end are in a position where they have to work because without that, they will not have resources. Those who had pensions, who worked in high-end blue-collar jobs or white-collar jobs, they're actually going to retire. They've had their work and they've got the resources to retire. But then it turns out that the higher educated people working at higher end positions, which is much of the Jewish community, are not planning to retire at 55, 60, or even 65. And that they're going to continue working, continue wanting to find meaningful engagement. So it's a reminder that this population that we're looking at, it may well be working, but we know something else as well. Those who work actually are going to volunteer at a higher level than those who don't work. This too, and I have to have a caveat that the USA was more problematic because we have this strange depth of despair in the lower high school and below educated white population, which over the last few years has been the only group to actually show a rise in the level of mortality. But given that, I want you to look at this as well, which is we don't see a declining life satisfaction. When you're young, you love life and you're happy. And then it's less so when you're working hard and raising a family and you're exhausted. And then as you age, you get more depressed and more sad. Quite the opposite. It turns out that as people age, they actually increase in their sense of satisfaction in life, in their joy in living. And again, that's something we want to tap into, as opposed to seeing it so important. Because in the decades that Stuart and I have been working on this, we are often paired with serious geriatric cases. So we're the only ones talking about life vitality when others are talking about how to take care of these poor people who can't take care of themselves. I think that's a mindset that we need very much to break. The other point that is important for us to understand, you all know this because I'm not telling you something that isn't coming from the surveys, the consistent surveys, which is you're not going to find this crowd necessarily in shul. They're not going to be there every Shabbat morning. That is not the way. Much unlike America at large, the Jewish community is a community based much more on culture, on relationships, on family, on celebrations, but not necessarily in terms of religious. You know, the Pew study, which shows that having a good sense of humor, being socially active, thinking about the Holocaust is far more significant than following Jewish law. So if our interest is to find them, we may find them in synagogues and find a way to engage them, but we're gonna have to look in many, many other places if our goal is to be able to engage the Jewish community. That said, in all of our research, and this is about 8 studies that we've done across the continent, including Canada as well, we are showing a vulnerability among those over 55 and older. We show a vulnerability. Boomers and empty nesters show the same signs of weak fidelity as do younger Jews. In other words, when asked the questions, would you consider leaving the synagogue or leaving the organization? Guess what? They're showing similar patterns, which means if we want to hold on to them and engage them, we're going to have to find new ways to do that to ensure that they're going to continue being part of our community, engaged in our community, particularly after the pandemic, which you'll hear more about, where people got used to sitting at home and being online, being Jewish, and getting to see a synagogue that could be 1,000 miles, 3,000 miles away. We're going to have to think very hard about ways of re-engagement, getting them back in the room and back into the life of the Jewish community. The other point that I wanted to show here is there are these books about baby boomers screwing over, right, the young. But it turns out that is not the case. Cross-generational programming that consciously includes those in vital aging populations makes sense, right? That we should want to be able to imagine, and we'll hear more about that, intergenerational as opposed to segmenting and separating generations, that actually we should think more about cross-generational divides. Thanks so much, and looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much, David. As usual, that was incredibly helpful context. I love the mindset around life vitality. If you look at the entire field of positive psychology, there has been a sea change about how we look at people. And I also love the points you're making around weak fidelity with older adults and younger. So important. Thank you for that. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Janet Aronson, the Associate Director of the Cohen Center for Jewish Modern Studies and Steinert Social Research Institute at Brandeis University. Janet will address the topic of active aging engagement in a post-pandemic world and will focus on the impact of COVID on the finances and health of Jewish households. Welcome, Janet.
Hey. Thank you so much. Just confirming you can see my screen. Everybody see it?
We sure can.
All right, thank you. Thanks for being here. And I think what David spoke about is a great introduction to what I'll be addressing today. This is what I'll be talking about is the results, some data from some studies that we conducted at my research center at Brandeis. We conducted during COVID. Most of these were conducted during 2020. So of course, things have changed since then. Those were the early days. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from this. One study was from people who are on federation lists in 10 different communities around the United States. The other study was from 2 specific communities, Greater Metro West New Jersey and Metropolitan Chicago. So I'll be sharing some data from both. The first thing I'd like to talk about is general well-being, which includes finances and health. About a fifth of people in households in Jewish communities say that they are struggling financially. This means either they say that they don't have enough money or they just barely have enough money. We can think about what are the characteristics of this group, of these groups, but for this purpose, what I want to really focus on is the bar on the right, the ages of these groups. And you can see that that financially struggling portion of the community is of all ages. It's sort of roughly comparable to the population as a whole. And so you can see that this is a concern for people of all ages, including this boomer generation. What's most important about people who are financially struggling to know during COVID is that they were the ones who were hardest hit by COVID financially. So the people who were doing poorly, things got worse for them. For the people who were doing well, most of them said that it's about the same or even got better. But I want to talk about emotional difficulties. There has been a lot of headlines about the challenges for young people during the pandemic. I will say that when we began these studies of how Jews were faring during COVID, one of the top concerns was about isolated elderly people and how they would cope. My suspicion is that their situation did not change that much. Of course, I'm going to set aside people in nursing homes. That's a whole different story. But for generally people at home, they continued to be isolated. I don't know that their situation got worse. And everybody thought young people, well, they'll have the internet, they'll be on their phones. What difference will it make? It turned out, and I'm sure you've all heard the headlines, that young people have really been hit hard during COVID. With the emotional difficulties. But what this slide shows you is these are 3 questions asking, did you have any emotional difficulties that hurt your ability to function in your day-to-day life just in the past week? That's the blue bar. Did you say that you're not coping too well? That's the red bar. And the other things are, did you feel lonely and did you need help? And you can see that even though the youngest cohort on the left reported these the most, every age group experienced these at a significant level during this one snapshot, this 1 week of COVID. Here is where there is a big difference, is the first bar is how frequently were you in contact with somebody? And you see people were in contact, and this could have been in person or on the phone. And the second question is, do you have support networks nearby? Do you have people nearby that you feel that you can call on to count on? And you can see that younger people, about half of them do. And this is something that does diminish with age. So this may be something to think about, is how older people are integrated with their communities on a personal level. Next, I'm going to move into talking about Jewish engagement during the pandemic. I have to just step back, and this ties in very well with what David was talking about, Jewish engagement in general. In the studies that we do of the Jewish community, we've developed a model of 5 categories of Jewish engagement that, instead of sort of the normal categories of denomination or affiliated or unaffiliated, we look at a whole host of Jewish behaviors, including the cultural behaviors, communal behaviors, and ritual behaviors. And we develop a model that say, how are people Jewishly engaged? I won't go into more detail about it now, but suffice it to say that on these tables, the group who are minimally involved on the left do very little in Jewish life, very little of any of those behaviors. The group on the right, immersed, they do everything. And then the 3 groups in the middle do different kinds of things. And you'll see example, Greater Metro West New Jersey. For those not familiar, that is a primarily suburban community, a lot of older people spread out, no really center of Jewish life. And the age group that has the largest share who are minimally involved, the least involved in Jewish life, is the 65 to 74. A third of them are not really involved in Jewish life. And because most people think, oh, it's the young people who are not involved, this is rather surprising. Another example, in metropolitan Chicago, we can see this is divided a little bit differently, but the group that is most engaged in Jewish life are, maybe not surprisingly, parents of children, school-age children. In that's the largest share in the immersed group. And what I've circled on the left, the singles and couples who are between age 40 and 70, and they have the largest share in the personal group, and particularly Jewish singles of all ages, older Jewish singles. I think that is a group to definitely keep our eyes on. And now I want to talk specifically about online Jewish life, which David also mentioned. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was so much hope that online Jewish life would be the silver lining, that would be what we would, the opportunity for, while people were stuck at home, for Jewish life to expand. The thought was that would reduce so many barriers to participation, whether it was travel or transportation or time, that people would all of a sudden be able to access these Jewish resources because they were stuck at home, that they would do classes, that they would explore. So the big question was, would Jewish life reach audiences, reach new audiences? Would people take advantage of new opportunities? So in short, the answer is no, it did not. And I'll talk about some of the ways why. So first, one question early on, if you remember back to that first 2020 Seder and what everybody was going to do and the idea of the Zoom Seder. So more than half of non-Orthodox Jews had a virtual Seder in that first year of the pandemic. 18% did not have a Seder at all. People who said that they always have a Seder, they just skipped the Seder altogether. So that's one little data point to think about. And this is a quote. We have a lot of interesting quotes in here, but there was a lot of grief about the loss of community, the loss of the in-person community of people who are active in Jewish life. And I think that that's going to be one of the main themes, and I'll talk about that at the end. Then we asked the question, how often did you participate in Jewish life before the pandemic? And how often have you done something online recently in the last month? And if you look at this chart, so this is really important, of the people who said, I never did anything before, almost all of them said, I haven't done anything in the last month either. Of the people who said, I did something at least weekly before the pandemic, almost all of them did some online Jewish life. So basically, the takeaway here is that online Jewish life replaced in-person Jewish life. It didn't really attract new audiences. So what was it that people were doing? And if we could look at the bars of the people who said, I do a Jewish life often, what kinds of things were people doing? Well, more than half said, I did a new program, a program that I had not done before. About a third said that they used some new resources that they hadn't used before. A little more than a quarter said that they access some new community, which could be an organization or a group that they hadn't been in touch with before. And just 17% said that I met new people, that I connected with new people that I had not done before. Now, again, this was early on in the pandemic, but at that time, the majority of people who participated in online Jewish life said that they planned to continue. So people were pretty satisfied with their Jewish life. I would love to ask them again today. And so you can see the people who said that they participated often, about 85% that they expected to do so in the future. I just want to end with a couple of quotes that we got from our participants. So the first two really talk about the opportunities of online Jewish life. One person talks about that they had not been able to attend services before. And now this is someone who wanted to attend services but couldn't because of timing and logistics. And this was their chance, and they hope to make it part of their ritual. The second was the weekly Shabbat call with the extended family, and talking about that as something they had not done before and what a blessing that was to do that and hoping to continue. But the third one, and I think that this is the main takeaway of all of the discussion about online Jewish life, is what is clear: there is no substitute for in-person engagement. I think that online Jewish life provides tremendous opportunities to reach people who hadn't been reached before, for people, I think David said this, attend services anywhere around the country, around the world, hear a wonderful lecture, access resources from organizations, whether it's in Jerusalem or Europe or down the block. And I think that that is the greatest benefit of of online Jewish life, but that we absolutely need to consider how we are going to provide opportunities for people to connect in person. And I can envision hybrid kinds of programs, and I know some organizations are talking about this, the possibility of watch a lecture online and then come together in person as a group to discuss it, take the class together. So that's the thought I'd like to leave with, and really just really support this work. I just turned 60 myself, and I hope that there'll be many resources in place by the time I retire. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aronson. Very, very interesting. And I think that painful data point that as we age, our local support networks diminish over time, and how to really combat that, how to address that with our programming. We are going to be hearing from different practitioners and their program models that do just that, but very helpful research and context. Thank you for that. We are now, and let me remind the audience, please, in real time, as questions bubble up, I see some questions that came in, put them in the chat now for Dr. Aronson. So when we move into the Q&A after our next speaker, we can really turn to what's top of mind for all of you, the audience. So next, we're going to hear from Dr. Kathleen Pike. She is the professor at the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and Mailman School of Public Health. She is also the director of the Columbia WHO's Center for Global Mental Health. Dr. Pike, over to you and welcome.
Thanks so much. It's really great to join you all. As the director of the Center for Global Mental Health in the WHO Collaborating Center, I also co-direct our Health and Aging Policy Fellows Program. And so it's with that lens that I'm going to speak to you a bit about the global picture of what we have seen in terms of aging, what the health implications have been for older adults in the context of COVID, and what the predictors are that really contribute to promoting health span and positive experience of aging and living as an older adult in the world that we live in today. So briefly, I'll start with just a few lessons, and looking at this really from a mental health lens is the particular lens that I'd like to share with you all today, because in fact, we know that good mental health is one of the strongest predictors of life satisfaction and thriving across the developmental spectrum. So beginning with a few lessons learned, we know that the vast majority of COVID-19 deaths were impacted those who were 50 years and older. So this was a community that was especially significantly hit in the last few years with the pandemic. And additionally, the mitigation strategies such as lockdown, social distancing, reduced community activities were even disproportionately significant for older adults, especially older adults who lived in certain congregate settings. So what resulted, we saw lots of newspaper headlines, many forecasts that older adults were going to have major mental health consequences as a result of the pandemic. And all kinds of predictions related to frailty and anxiety and depression and cognitive decline that would be sequelae, that would be unintended consequences of actually trying to keep people safe. So what have we found? What have the studies found? We found that, and these are studies, I'm just going to share with you some snapshots globally, that consistently around the world, older adults have been the strongest participants in vaccine programs. So you have the highest rate of vaccination of any group among those who are over 65 years old. And we see that in the US, we see it around the world. And while so I think that's a really interesting and a very good sign in terms of engagement and in terms of older adults claiming agency around what they can do to increase the opportunities then that will permit them to engage with the world and address this pandemic. A study by AARP on healthy living for adults age 50 and older. It was a study of about 2,000 adults, and the sample in the US, oversampling for African Americans and Hispanic Latinos. And it was an online survey that was done in 2022, so very recent data. And what the findings show is that most older adults say that their emotional and mental health are actually very good. Many say they have experienced depression and anxiety, symptoms of depression and anxiety when asked about their mental health. So for example, 2/3 of older adults age 50 plus say that their emotional mental health is excellent. That's dramatic in the wake of this pandemic. At the same time, they're acknowledging that they feel symptoms of anxiety and depression. So I think the really important piece of this finding is that looks at both what older adults are reporting in terms of their emotional and mental health, and the reality of feeling anxious, feeling symptoms of depression. They're both true. So we have older adults facing emotional challenges in the last number of years, reporting elevated rates of depression or depressive symptoms, elevated rates of experiences of anxiety, but living with both of those and actually feeling that net, they're feeling that their mental health and emotional well-being is strong. And in fact, in this study, about 15% of the older adults reported that they feel that they are actually stronger and more resilient coming out of the last few years, which is a really strong statement around this idea of sort of the hero's journey and post-traumatic growth, and how if we go into a difficult situation with the appropriate or necessary skills and reserves to be able to face the challenge, it actually can be an opportunity for significant growth. There's a similar study that was conducted in Mexico across 3 different time points during the pandemic of about 2,000 adults. And older adults, interestingly, and I think we've seen this, I know this anecdotally in the US, but haven't seen official data, that older adults actually presented less concern about COVID-19 initially when the pandemic hit, and in fact were fairly resistant and less adherent to some of the prevention procedures at the beginning, right? Maybe some of us can remember talking to our older parents or ourselves thinking, oh, what does it matter? I really want to see my grandchild, or I'm willing to take that risk, right? That over time declined so that people actually older adults became much more adherent to the prevention procedures. Similar to the US data, levels of depressive symptoms and anxiety went up a bit. Stress, older adults could accurately report on increased stress, but the proportion of older adults who identified elevated rates of anxiety, depressive symptoms, stress is actually significantly less than that reported by the younger cohorts. So again, we're seeing a pattern of older adults responding to the global pandemic in a way that doesn't align with the forecasts that covered the headlines in the early stages of the pandemic. Similar findings in Singapore. Older adults were found to report significantly lower levels of depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and stress compared to younger adults. And also, although older adults were less able to perform their essential activities during lockdown, there were ways in which they were more restricted. They actually reported greater adaptability. So what are some of the strongest predictors? Clearly not everyone has done well, but I think the big picture is that there's a tendency to dramatize the group that's in trouble and lose track of the group that's thriving. And somebody had mentioned positive psychology and the data there. There's a lot for us to learn about who's thriving and what matters and what helps people thrive. And that's clearly what this meeting is about. And one of the strongest predictors, consistent with what David has said and what Janet has said already, is that social connection and the experience of feeling socially connected in a meaningful way is one of the strongest predictors of actually coming out with the more positive experience of thriving. Adaptability, which is something of a temperament characteristic, but can be cultivated and can grow intentionally, has significant impact as in the general picture around aging, but particularly in the context of this global pandemic. The group that is at risk before the pandemic is the group that's even at more risk after the pandemic. So I think one of the things for us to think about is that big events like this exacerbate pre-existing conditions. So individuals who had significant mental health issues previously, individuals who lived in significant economic distress, were significantly at greater risk coming out of the pandemic. And conversely, having a high level of education and standard of socioeconomic status was positively correlated with increased resilience and more thriving coming through the pandemic. And the fifth point, the fifth strongest predictor was physical activity and mobility. So being able to be physically active and mobile, even if that meant within certain constraints, but being able to stay physically active is a significant positive predictor. So social connection, adaptability, mental health status going into the pandemic, education and SES, and physical activity and mobility. So as we think about some of the critical negative predictors, right, the converse of that are some conditions that really we need to be tending to early on, long before we reach this category of older adult, which is around chronic conditions of health, long-term health conditions like diabetes, heart condition, some of which are significantly can be positively impacted very early on and will actually put people on a course to be more prepared and more adaptable in the context of stresses and thrive in old age. or older as older adults. Chronic pain. Chronic pain is a really serious issue for older adults and has very significant predictive impact in terms of how we're going to do when there's increased stress in the system. So I'm going to wrap up here with 5 key takeaways. That it's absolutely true that older adults have been the group that's been most dramatically impacted in terms of COVID-19 deaths. It's absolutely true that this group, our group of older adults, has had significant mental health symptoms and recognizes them and reports them in terms of anxiety, in terms of depressive symptoms, in terms of loneliness and stress. At the same time, this group is reporting very high levels of resilience and optimism and doing much better than younger adults overall. Fourth, that there are significant modifiable factors that predict health span, that predict healthy aging, and that we need to pay attention to those early on, because that's going to set a foundation and a course. And fifth, as David mentioned, this older adulthood, we're living into a life expectancy that's significantly increased, that is really unknown territory. And there's a human nature and a media nature that when we are in the unknown, there's significant anxiety and there's significant fear-mongering that goes on in the context of unknown or just forecasting about worst case. And that in fact, there are good data that the worst case is not the story for older adults, but in fact, we're struggling to claim that narrative. And I think the fifth takeaway for me is that this community, and for our health and aging policy fellows, for example, is being very intentional in thinking about who will claim this narrative of what it means to live as an older adult in the US or globally, and how do we learn from those that are thriving to bring along the part of the community that's not. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, thank you, Dr. Pike. So many things to think about. And welcome back, Dr. Aronson. We are just thrilled to have this time to talk. I've noticed some questions coming into the chat. Truly, this is our audience's time to ask questions of these two extraordinary women. So please do. I'm looking right now. Let me pause before we jump in and just ask for a beat. Dr. Aronson, as you, and then I'm going to ask Dr. Pike this as well, and then we're going to go to these questions in the chat. As you heard and listened to Dr. Pike right now, what bubbled up, kind of really struck you? Just one thing top of mind.
Thanks for asking me. So I agree with the comments, with so much of what Dr. Pike said really resonated. I agree with the comment in the chat about the resilience of this older generation. I think as expressed by Gamzeya Avor that someone wrote. But I do want to point out what I think is one of the major differences in the experiences of why this is so hard for young adults. And I think of my children in their late 20s and their early 30s, that those are years that they have lost those years of their lives, that this is the time they moved to new cities, they took new jobs, they were supposed to be out making new friends. And you cannot recover your years between 26, 27, and 28 if you can't do all the things you were supposed to do then. And I think that that's the main challenge for young adults, that older people, okay, I sat in my house for 3 years. It's all right. I got a nice house. So I think that it's not just the attitude. I think that there is a real loss for young adults that older people haven't experienced.
Thank you for that. Dr. Pike, what's resonating for you as you heard Dr. Aronson's presentation and in response to her observation right now?
Yeah. So one of the things that strikes me most significantly from the data that you presented, Dr. Aronson, is that the issues of engagement and social engagement, what people, history is a best predictor of the future, right? So those who were engaged continued to be engaged. And you made the comment, the data are quite dramatic, that we weren't picking up new people, engaging new people. They were just engaging in a different way with the Jewish community. And so I think that is really telling in terms of thinking about how do we as a Jewish community and how do program leaders think about engagement. The foundation is set early. So much of what we describe for older adults is set up long before anyone would call themselves an older adult. And so thinking about that strategically is, I think, really essential for the future of a community like the Jewish community and the vitality of the Jewish community. The other thing I might say, just in terms of the loss for young people, just in response to Dr. Aronson, I totally agree on the one hand, and on the other hand, about the young people, I think a piece of it is they have a lot less life experience, right? So you build resilience in life experience, and they have a lot less of that. And I want to just put a little bit of a warning out there for all of us who have young adults, that the more we tell them that they've lost the opportunity to do something in this stage of life, the more it becomes true. And I don't know that it's so true. What's happening developmentally, because we're living longer, means we actually have this, I think we have a new stage of early adulthood. Like there's a whole new developmental window that's going on and that's emerging. And it also is an opportunity. And so for all of the young adults who were home for a gap year, as difficult as it was to be home in their parents' houses, there are lots of stories about enormous opportunities too. So I am concerned that we as adults who worry about our kids and worry that they missed out on the exact, the developmental experiences that we had, that was going to happen anyway, because like things are different for them. And so how do we help them not develop a narrative where they think they've lost 3 years of their lives? Because those 3 years could really set them up to do some amazing work going forward, because they have actually lived through this.
Yeah. We thank you so much. It's so rich listening. And it reminds me, when I think about older adults and I think about younger adults, they both hold a liminal, betwixt and between space.
Mm-hmm.
It is a transitional space, and that is also a very creative space. It's a space for imagination. And I love thinking about new developmental windows, not just for older adults, but for the young, which is why they're such beautiful natural partners. And we're going to hear so much more about that with our intergenerational models. Is there a way, I'm just going to go to Faye in the chat, is there a way to talk a little about resiliency of older adults as it has to do with work opportunities, this huge emerging field, as we know, of older adults being employed and working much more and being much more part of the workforce. How might you look at that in terms of both Dr. Aronson thinking of the diminishment of those local support networks, right? And Dr. Pike, that notion of vitality. Where's the sweet spot? And maybe starting with you, Dr. Aronson. Yes, there's programmatic interventions, and there's good old work and being part of, part-time and other entry points. So can you speak a little to that?
Well, I don't have data, but I think that certainly it makes sense that to the extent that people are more engaged in their work life, they're more engaged with people and with life. And my concern with is that specifically when it comes to Jewish engagement, that as people retire and have more time, people really may be looking to do other things that, yes, I think somebody mentioned, you may want to take your professional skills and transition them and do them as a volunteer in the Jewish world. But I think that people are actually looking for something different. And, and maybe this is just conjecture, maybe people are holding on to work because that is what they have. And as they're looking for finding new meaning in life, all of the issues of facing the end of life that I believe Judaism is deeply positioned to help people think about. That to say, well, the only way you can continue to find meaning when you're 65 or 70 is to continue your job, I find that kind of a loss. And that is the opportunity for Judaism to step in and say, here are these riches of meaning and spirituality and finding a new life purpose that maybe you never had time for because you were busy working. So that's what I would love to see.
Yeah, beautiful. Dr. Pike, last word for you, and then I'm just going to acknowledge a couple of things in the chat and then we'll transition.
Sure. I love that. And I totally agree with Dr. Aronson's comment. And I think just if you think about human nature, back to this idea about unknown, people are anxious in facing the unknown. That's a life-saving condition of being human, right? We feel anxious when we don't know. That raises our attention, that raises our focus. It's really adaptive, but we can get stuck there. And I think there are people who get stuck staying at work because that's what we know, and we know what feels good there, and we know how to do it, and we have a sense of agency and control and meaning and purpose. So to the extent that our Jewish community can build paths that people can see and recognize and say, I want to do that. I want to do that so much that I can actually leave what I know, is going to be really, really important.
And yes, that unknown space again, which is why it can be so scary, and why today's conversations with all these models, including really looking at economic diversity and the needs. And I'm looking at Faye's comment, a lot of people do have to continue to bring in, a resources there. And that said, I want to say to those in your comments in the chat, which are very helpful, some of them, Nancy, I'm looking at yours in particular. We will circle back to you about some of the data points. So please know that even though we weren't able to address all of these in this discussion.
Can I take just 10 seconds to address that comment?
Beautiful, even better. Yes.
As a clarification for everyone.
Yes.
That I was talking about any kind of Jewish engagement. So in other words, the people who participated in person transitioned to online. So we weren't comparing. So yes, a lot of organizations picked up new people, but they were people who were already active, for the most part, active in Jewish life in other organizations in other ways. They weren't people who were disengaged from Jewish life who were entering the first time.
Very good. Thank you for that clarification. So we are going to transition now to breakout groups. So this will be more opportunity to explore the impact and opportunities the pandemic presented to each of you and your organization, especially around engaging older adults. You are going to have 20 minutes for these discussions. There will be facilitators in each of the rooms to help tee up the conversations. So please do stay around. These are your opportunities to bring on the learning back home. And without further ado, we're going to go to breakouts. Thank you, everyone. See you after.